veseljem že drugi dan VIDES Slovenija pripravlja program VIDES kamp z naslovom Od besed k dejanjem. In smo zbrani prostovoljci mali iz različnih krajev Slovenije. Med nami sta pa tudi dva prostovoljca iz Anglije, ki jih toplo najprej pozdravljam, Joshua in Pam. In skupaj si delimo naše bogatstvo z prostovoljskih taborov. Današnji dan je spregovoril na temo o aktivnem državljanstvu in smo imeli že dopoldnevu gostjo, Mojco Kusler-Dolinar, in smo se spraševali, kako biti tudi mi danes mladi, slovenski mladi, bolj aktivni, zavzeti v naši družbi, da bi bil svet tudi v Sloveniji boljši. In smo prišli do lepih zaključkov. Zdaj se pa veselimo tudi današnjega večera, ko je tukaj med nami naš dragi prijatelj Josephom Mussomelijem, ki je ameriški ambasador. In nam bo tudi on danes pregovoril o svoji izkušnji, kako biti bolj zaveden državljan, kako biti bolj ponosen na svoje korenine, na svojo zgodovino, na svojo državo, na svoje deželo. Govoril nam bo pa tudi o svoji izkušnji iz službovanj, ki jih je imel že v svojem življenju. Bil namreč ambasador tudi v Kambodži in še v nekaterih drugih državah. Zdaj je pa tukaj v Sloveniji, zaključuje sicer svoj mandat, ampak smo veseli, da se je ta mandat malo podaljšal in bo lahko delil še to svojo izkušnjo z nami. Tako da prisrčno dobrodošel. Very welcome here among us. And for the start we will sing, bomo za začetek zapeli eno pesem z naslovom Mnogo poti. In se zahvaljujemo, da so te številne poti, po katerih hodimo, nas danes pripeljale tukaj skupaj.
Can I say something
Yes.
now? First off, thank you all for inviting me here today. It's a great honor for me to be with you.
Najprej najlepša hvala za povabilo. Veliko čast mi je, da sem lahko nocoj z vami.
When Sister Barbara asked me to come, I immediately said yes.
Ko je sestra Barbara me prosila, da pridem, sem takoj rekel da.
Because when I was a little boy, I was taught by nuns.
Ker ko sem bil še otrok, so me vzgajale sestre.
And whenever I didn't do what they said, they would beat me.
In kadarkoli nisem storil česa, kar so mi rekle, so me nateple.
So even now, though I'm 61, when a nun tells me to do something, I just do it.
Tako tudi sedaj, ko sem star 61 let, ko mi sestra reče, naj nekaj naredim.
And before I even begin, I should also commend you on the beautiful singing. I'm always amazed at how beautiful the singing is in Slovenia.
In preden začnem, bi rad pohvalil vaše petje. Vedno znova sem presenečen, kako lepo petje imate v Sloveniji.
I'm amazed, not because I've heard that Slovenes have beautiful voices, but in America, people who are shy never sing. But in Slovenia, most of you are very shy, but you sing anyway.
Presenečen sem pa zato, ne zato, ker bi imeli tako lepe glasove, ampak zato, ker v Ameriki, ko je nekdo sramežljiv, ne poje. V Sloveniji pa, čeprav ste sramežljivi, vseeno pojete.
You're way ahead of us.
Torej ste daleč pred nami.
So today I've been asked to talk about culture and love of country and our dedication and devotion to our nationality or our cultures.
Naprošen sem bil, da spregovorim nekaj besed o kulturi, o ljubezni do domovine, predanosti domovini in našim kulturam, se pravi o nacionalni zavesti.
And I thought I would compare how I see American culture and patriotism compared to Slovenia and other countries where I've lived.
Zato sem se odločil, da bom primerjal ameriško kulturo in patriotizem s slovensko kulturo in še druge kulture morda.
And, but I don't want to talk for a whole hour.
Ne želim govoriti celo uro.
So please feel free to interrupt me with questions whenever you want.
Kadarkoli želite, me lahko prekinete in postavite kakšno vprašanje.
Če kdo ne zna v angleščini, lahko slovensko vpraša, bomo prevedli tudi vprašanje, ni problema.
He'll translate?
Yeah.
Okay. And if one of the nuns hits you for interrupting me, I'll stop them.
Če vas kakšna sestra udari, ker ste me prekinili, bom ustavil.
But please, I don't mind being interrupted. I have 3 children, so I'm used to children being rude. So just interrupt anytime.
Naj vas ne bo sram, da me prekinete, imam 3 otroke in sem navajen, da so otroci nesramni, tako da lahko me prekinete kadarkoli.
So let me begin by saying that I think we should just talk about what love and devotion is, and if we look at it in a big concept, we realize very quickly that there's many types of love and some of them are not very good.
Na začetku bi se dotaknili tega, kaj pomeni ljubezen in predanost. Če res pogledamo na to malo širše, ugotovimo, da obstaja več vrst ljubezni in da niso vse dobre.
One could say almost that there's certain types of twisted love, and certainly when you talk about love of country, that can be very true.
Obstaja tudi sprevržene ljubezni in ko govorimo o ljubezni do domovine, se to lahko še posebej pokaže.
For example, in America, we have a very strong sense of nationality. Even though we're from hundreds of different countries, we all think of ourselves very strongly as Americans.
V Ameriki imamo zelo močno nacionalno zavest, čeprav prihajajo ljudje iz različnih koncev sveta, imajo zelo močno zavest, da pripadajo Ameriki.
But there's at least 2 types of love of America or love of any country that I think are very unhealthy.
Obstajata pa vsaj 2 vrsti ljubezni do domovine, ki po mojem mnenju nista preveč zdravi.
Many Americans have an inability to ever find fault, any sort of mistake with America, ever.
En pogled je malo bolj perfekcionističen, se pravi, da ljudje ne vidijo nič slabega na Ameriki sploh.
And the other type of sort of a twisted love of country is finding nothing but fault with your country. That you love it, but you're so disappointed always that it doesn't meet your expectations.
Druga skrajnost je, da vedno vidiš samo slabe stvari, da imaš sicer rad svojo domovino, vendar nikoli ne doseže tvojih pričakovanj.
You could see this in relationships between parents and children or men and women, that especially with parents and children, that even if their child is very bad, they always make an excuse for the child.
Takšne sprevržene ljubezni lahko vidimo tudi v drugih odnosih v družini. Naprimer, če je otrok nevzgojen, starši še vseeno ne morejo videti nič slabega na njem.
You probably have some parents like that. They're never happy with you.
Ali starši, ki niso nikoli zadovoljni z otroki.
And the opposite, that no matter what you do, either they're never happy with you or they're always defending you.
Se pravi, obstajata 2 skrajnosti, ali starši niso nikoli zadovoljni, ali pa vedno samo branijo svoje otroke.
But and I think when I was growing up, when I was about your age, I fell more into the category that America could never do anything right. I was angry with America all the time.
Ko sem bil vaše starosti, sem bil ves čas jezen na Ameriko in sem bolj pripadal tej drugi kategoriji, nikoli ni dosegla mojih pričakovanj.
Because countries, like people, always disappoint you.
Zato, ker te država, tako kot ljudi, vedno razočara.
Everyone makes mistakes, everyone has weaknesses, and if you have an ideal, then you're always frustrated.
Ljudje se vedno motijo, vedno delajo napake in če imaš v glavi nek ideal, potem nisi nikoli zadovoljen.
So when I was 20, I left America and decided I would never go back.
In ko sem bil star 20 let, sem zapustil Ameriko in se odločil, da ne grem nikoli več nazaj.
I decided I'd come to Europe because Europeans were so much better and I would never see my family or friends ever again.
Odločil sem se, da pridem v Evropo, ker Evropejci ste tako boljši, a ne, kot Amerika, in sem se odločil, da ne grem nikoli več nazaj, nikoli več ne bom srečal več svoje družine.
But wherever I went, except Yugoslavia, but wherever else I went, everyone was criticizing America and saying nasty things about America.
Ampak kamorkoli sem šel, so ljudje govorili slabe stvari o Ameriki in kritizirali Ameriko.
And I found myself, even though I didn't like America, I found myself defending it all the time.
In čeprav nisem maral svoje domovine, sem jo vedno znala branil pred temi kritikami.
It's sort of, again, if we use the child-parent analogy, you could criticize your child every day, but you hate it when some stranger criticizes your child.
Če se spet vrnemo k primeri v družini, lahko vsak dan kritiziraš svojega otroka, ampak ko to počne nekdo drug, pač tega ne maraš.
So I concluded from that situation that I should go back to America, even though it was imperfect and had done many mistakes. But a mature love is accepting, whether it's a person or a child or a country, understanding it's not perfect, but that it's your relationship with it to make it better.
In zato sem se odločil, da se vrnem nazaj, čeprav moja domovina ni popolna, ampak zrela ljubezen sprejme tudi nepopolnosti in preko odnosa se pravzaprav stvari izboljšajo. Preko odnosa z državo ali z osebo lahko stvari spremenimo na bolje.
So when I think of Slovenia now, I think that most Slovenes sort of fall into the same category I did when I was 20. Always frustrated and disappointed with Slovenia, that it doesn't come up to the expectations of the individual Slovene people.
In ko sedaj pomislim na Slovenijo, vidim, da večina ljudi pade v to drugo kategorijo, isto kot sem bil sam v mladosti. Veliko ljudi ni zadovoljnih, so razočarani in država nekako ne izpolnjuje individualnih pričakovanj ljudi.
But if a foreigner ever criticizes Slovenia, those same Slovenes will be furious.
Toda, če se zgodi, da tujec kritizira Slovenijo, bodo isti Slovenci goreče branili domovino.
Whereas if you have a secure devotion to your country, if you really love your country in a mature way, whether you're American or Slovene or anything else, you're neither too critical of your country or too sensitive to other people's criticisms of the country.
Če pa imamo nek zrel odnos do domovine, potem nismo niti preveč kritični, niti preveč občutljivi na kritike drugih. Se pravi, imamo neko zdravo ravnovesje.
And in America, most of them fall into the other immature category, that whatever America does, it's right, or it's excusable.
Se pravi, v Ameriki je večina ljudi v tisti kategoriji, ki poveličuje domovino, vse je v redu, vse je dobro, vse se da opravičiti.
And when I think and I try to figure out why America is so cohesive and strong in its devotion to the nation, and Slovenia is not, it's a great paradox.
In ko razmišljam o tem, zakaj so v Ameriki ljudje tako povezani in res tako predani domovini, Slovenija pa ni, vidim nek paradoks.
It's a paradox because Slovenes have almost everything in common. You have the same language mostly, you have the same history, the same culture, the same religion pretty much, if you have a religion. Everything, you're all of the same ethnic group, with very few exceptions.
Paradoks je v tem, da v Sloveniji imamo večinoma iste korenine, isto zgodovino, podobne poglede, se pravi, pripadamo isti kulturi, v Ameriki pa pač tega ni.
And America's just the opposite. We're all different colors, we're all from different countries, we speak different languages, we're 1,000 different religions, and yet we're much more cohesive.
V Ameriki je pa veliko različnih kultur, beli in črni, različne jezike govorijo, različne religije imajo, ampak so vseeno veliko bolj povezani in bolj predani domovini.
Not this 4th of July, but the July 4th before, I gave a talk on this at the celebration, that the great American motto is a pluribus unum, out of many one.
Lansko leto, 4. julija, sem imel govor.
A pluribus unum?
Ja.
It's Latin for out of many one.
Spravi, da je geslo Amerike iz večjih eno, vsi za eno.
Whereas in Slovenia it's almost the opposite. You're one people, but you're scattered in many different ways.
V Sloveniji je pa pravzaprav nasprotno. Prihajamo iz enega, ampak smo razdeljeni na toliko različnih pogledov.
And I think this goes to what binds the different countries together.
In vzrok tega je verjetno vprašanje, kaj pravzaprav povezuje različne države skupaj.
In Slovenia, one of the things I'm very envious of is the notion that what you really binds you together is your culture and your language and your devotion to your poets and your writers. That's a very wonderful thing.
Sem kar malo ljubosumen na Slovence, ker povezuje vas ista kultura, ljubezen do pesnikov, pisateljev.
We would, in Slovenia, your main square is Prešeren Square. We would never have a square in Washington, Whitman Square or Edgar Allan Poe Square. It's always about soldiers or politicians, not about poets and writers.
V Sloveniji je glavni trg imenovan po Prešernu, našem največjem pesniku, medtem ko v Ameriki, v Washingtonu ne bi nikoli poimenovali trga po pesniku ali pisatelju, ampak predvsem po vojakih.
But I think Slovenia, in its small, short history, lacks two things, I think, that make it harder to be proud in a good way of Slovenia.
Po mojem mnenju v Sloveniji manjkata dve stvari, ki bi omogočili, da bi bili ponosni na svojo državo.
Yeah. And the first way is very terrible, but in a very real sense, Slovenia has not suffered enough.
Prva stvar je zelo grozna, ampak na nek način resnična. Slovenija še ni dovolj trpela.
In the sense that crises are things that bring people together. Like most of you are too young to remember how all Slovenes were brought together during the time of independence.
V smislu, da krize in težave pripeljejo ljudi skupaj, jih povežejo. Kot naprimer, večina od vas se mogoče ne spomne, ko se je Slovenija borila za samostojnost, je bil to res en tak trenutek, ko so ljudje stopili skupaj.
But in a sense, it was a great miracle and wonderful that there was so little suffering when you gained your independence.
Po drugi strani je bil to velik čudež in res čudovito, da se za samostojnost ni bilo treba toliko boriti oziroma trpeti.
But in a way you were cheated out of a shared suffering.
Ampak na nek način ste bili pravzaprav ogoljufani nekega skupnega trpljenja.
It was always the terrible times in American history, whether it was the Civil War or the bombing of Pearl Harbor or 9/11, that brings people together.
V Ameriki so bili vedno ti trenutki trpljenja v zgodovini, ki so pripeljali ljudi skupaj, pa naj se je šlo za civilno vojno ali za bombardiranje Pearl Harborja ali pa za napad na dvojčka.
And you could see that in personal relationships too. you could have good friends for a long time, but it's not a real deep relationship. But if you go through a terrible crisis together, you become closer friends.
V odnosih med ljudmi je enako. Lahko imaš nekega prijatelja zelo dolgo, pa pravzaprav ta odnos ni tako globok, kot če gre odnos preko krize, preko nekega trpljenja. In v teh trenutkih krize se ljudje še bolj povežejo.
Now, crises can tear you apart, like maybe the current economic crisis could tear Slovenia apart, but it's also an opportunity for Slovenes to actually work closer together and take pride in conquering or resolving the crisis.
Kriza lahko ljudi seveda tudi razdvoji. Recimo, trenutna ekonomska kriza lahko Slovenijo razdvaja, ampak po drugi strani je pa to tudi priložnost, da stopimo skupaj, da skupaj premagamo težave in da smo potem ponosni na to, kar nam je uspelo.
So I think that's one of the big problems. The other reason I think that there's not enough patriotism of a healthy type in Slovenia is because there hasn't been enough openness.
To je ena stvar. Drugi pogled je pa to, da menim, da v Sloveniji ni dovolj zdravega patriotizma, zaradi tega, ker ni bilo dovolj odprtosti še v Sloveniji.
America has many problems and many flaws, but what Americans always do is talk about its problems.
Amerika ima veliko napak, veliko problemov, ampak kar vedno delajo tam je, da se pogovarjajo o problemih odprto.
But for a long time, Slovenes couldn't talk about their history, at least certain parts of their history.
In zelo dolgo časa Slovenci niso mogli govoriti o svoji zgodovini oziroma vsaj o določenih delih zgodovine.
And that makes anger and resentment fester, as you know, when you can't express your anger.
In zaradi tega je jeza in odpor toliko močnejši, ko ga ne moreš izraziti.
I often use the analogy of the American Civil War and how we killed millions of each other during the Civil War, but right after the Civil War, we started talking about it and deciding there were good guys on both sides and bad guys on both sides and good reasons on both sides.
Pogosto uporabim primerjavo z Ameriko in s civilno vojno, ko so se pobijali med sabo, se pravi en drugega so pobijali, vendar so se potem po vojni usedeli skupaj in so se pogovarjali o tem in so se odločili, da na obeh stranih so bili dobri in slabi ljudje, na obeh stranih so bili dobri in slabi razlogi.
So, you know, I often joke about the fact that I'm married to a woman who was born in the southern part of America.
Pogosto se šalim, da sem poročen žensko, ki je bila rojena na jugu Amerike.
And I often call her a slave monger. And
Torej, pogosto ji rečem, kako bi to?
And a trader, a slave holder and trader.
Ja, sužnjevalka ali sužnjelastnik, izdajalka.
And she always calls me an imperialist and a war lover.
In ona mi vedno pravi, da sem imperialist v vojni.
But you can't joke like that in Slovenia yet.
Ja, ampak v Sloveniji se v teh stvarih še ne moremo šaliti.
And while the Civil War is still sensitive in America, in some ways, we've learned to talk about it openly.
In čeprav je civilna vojna v Ameriki še vedno občutljiva tema, smo se naučili odprto govoriti o tem.
Because without that discussion and openness, there's no mutual respect and appreciation for the other side.
Ker brez te odprtosti in pogovora, potem ni nobenega spoštovanja in ni prostora za razumevanje.
So this deep division in Slovenia stops the people from being close enough to have a real sense of national pride.
In ta globoka razdvojenost v Sloveniji pravzaprav preprečuje, da bi se lahko ljudje bolj povezali.
Except in the superficial ways, which all Slovenes agree on. The country is beautiful, the mountains are wonderful, the cities are lovely, but the deeper type of devotion that should bring all Slovenes together has not developed yet, but it's only been 20 years too.
Razen seveda kakšni takšne stvari, kot recimo vsi se strinjamo s tem, da je dežela lepa, da imamo lepe stvari, ampak ne moramo pa se strinjati v bolj globokih stvarih, ampak Slovenija je še mlada, komaj 20 let je stara.
Sometimes I think people expect too much from Slovenia, since it is only a young person, it's only 21 years old.
Včasih se mi zdi, da ljudje pričakujejo preveč od Slovenije, ker je le še mlada, 20 let je stara.
And at 21, America had no real sense of identity yet.
In ko je bila Amerika stara, toliko kot Slovenija, 21, ni imela nobenega občutka identitete še.
Have I talked enough? Any questions yet?
Se že dovolj govorim, imate kakšno vprašanje?
Should I talk more?
Ali naj nadaljujem?
So I could say a few other things. Having been in different countries, I could talk a little bit about what their identity is, especially, for example, the Philippines. The Philippines is really a group of different ethnic groups and different religions also, and they never were united.
In glede na to, da sem bil tudi drugod po svetu, lahko povem nekaj še o drugih kulturah, naprimer o Filipinih, kjer so tudi ljudje različnih kultur, različnih ver in nikoli niso bili posebej povezani.
But World War II changed that because of the Japanese occupation and the oppression by the Japanese. It actually brought the people together.
Ampak druga svetovna vojna je to spremenila zaradi japonske okupacije, so potem se ljudje bolj povezali.
Maybe we should ask the Japanese to invade Slovenia.
Mogoče bi morali prositi Japonce, naj pridejo v Slovenijo.
And of course you had your own historical experience with the Nazis and the fascists in Italy. But that didn't have the same result because you did not become Slovenia after World War II. You became Yugoslavia, and that changed the whole chemistry of what World War II meant.
Seveda ste imeli vi podobne izkušnje, mogoče z nacisti, s fašisti, ampak razlika je v tem, da potem niste postali Slovenija, ampak Jugoslavija, in to je pravzaprav spremenilo posledice druge svetovne vojne. Niso bile enake kot na Filipinih.
I could talk about Cambodia also, that Cambodia has two things that really unites it. One is the myths of its history, that it was once a great culture long, long ago, 1,500 years ago. And that myth, the Serbs have their own myths, very similar, the French do also. But this myth of the ancient glory keeps the national conscious together. Americans have their own myths.
Lahko spregovorim tudi nekaj besed o Kambodži. Kambodža ima po eni strani velike mite o zlatih časih, kako je bila Kambodža včasih 1500 let nazaj velika kultura, in ti miti jih povezujejo.
The other thing that keeps them together again is another great tragedy, the genocide under the Khmer Rouge. Everybody suffered. Everybody lost family members. It wasn't as if it was one side against the other in your own civil war, in your own history. Here it was the entire country suffered under the Khmer Rouge, and so it has brought them together more closely.
Druga stvar je to, da jih je velika tragedija prejšnjega stoletja povezala, to, da so utrpeli genocid in da so vsi izgubili ljubljene osebe. Ni bilo tako kot pri nas, da je mogoče ena stran utrpela, druga ne. Tam so vsi trpeli pod vlado teh rdečih Kmerov.
But then I could give you examples of very bad nationalism. For example, in Sri Lanka, where we lived for a few years.
Nekaj časa smo živeli tudi na Šri Lanki in to pa je primer nezdravega nacionalizma.
like Cambodia, it's based on a myth of the ancient glories of the Sri Lankan people.
Tako kot v Kambodži so tudi tam imajo velike mite o zlatih časih, o veliki kulturi.
But there it's used by the Buddhists to show their superiority to the Hindus.
Ampak tam je to uporabljeno tako, da preko tega budisti pokažejo svojo nadvlado nad hinduisti.
So the Buddhist Sinhalese use their history as a way to discriminate against the Tamil Hindus and to build a national identity that actually alienates part of their people.
Tako budisti uporabljajo to njihovo zgodovino, da pravzaprav diskriminirajo hindujce in na nek način jih osamijo, se pravi, izključujejo del naroda na račun budizma.
Which goes back to my original talk about that patriotism, love of country, can be a very, very good thing and a noble thing, but it could also be an extraordinarily evil thing.
Tako se spet vrnemo na začetek, ko sem izpostavil to, da je lahko ljubezen do domovine dobra in lahko je pa tudi zelo slaba in sprevržena.
Like any other love. Even love of God, it can be distorted in such a way to do horrible things. Love of country is the same way, if it's not mature and reasonable.
Kakor vsaka ljubezen, tudi ljubezen do Boga je lahko sprevržena in pripravi ljudi, da počnejo grozne stvari. Vsaka ljubezen mora biti zrela, da je potem lahko učinkovita.
I can't talk forever. You guys must have questions.
Ne moram večno govoriti, sigurno imate kakšno
Did I
vprašanje.
cover what you wanted me to, or do you?
I got a question.
Yes.
Where do you see the differences between Slovenia as it is now and America when America was 21 years old as far as national conscience goes?
Torej, samo da prevedemo vprašanje. Kje vidite razliko med Slovenijo in Ameriko, ko je bila tudi Amerika stara 21 let, tako kot je zdaj Slovenija, kakšna je razlika v tej narodni zavesti?
I'm very old, but I'm not old enough to know what America was in 1800. But I think some of the differences, one of the great things about America, I think, is that it always thinks it's young. It's over 200 years old and it still has this illusion that it's a young country. And that's something, when it was 21, was definitely true. So it always has this optimism and hope of the future because it's only 235 years old. So it's still a youngster. In Slovenia, the youthfulness of the country has worn off too quickly.
Torej, res je, da sem star, ampak nisem tako star, da bi vedel, kako je bilo v letih 1800, da bi videl, kako je to izgledalo takrat. Ena stvar, ki se mi zdi res tako, da je v Ameriki prisotna, je to, da ljudje mislijo, da je Amerika mlada. Čeprav še vedno, čeprav je stara že 223 let, je še vedno mlada in to je kot neka iluzija, ki jo imajo ljudje. Medtem ko v Sloveniji je ta občutek mladostnosti prehitro zbledel.
And I think it's very important, whether you're a country or a person, to always sort of think of yourself as still young. Or, some people are just born old. And some people never grow up. And neither of those things are very good, but not ever growing up is a lot better than being born old.
Ne glede na to, ali gre za državo ali za osebo, se mi zdi, da je zelo dobro, da vedno mislimo o sebi, da smo mladi. Nekateri ljudje se pač že rodijo stari, nekateri nikoli ne odrastejo, ampak mislim, da je bolje nikoli odrasti, kot roditi se že s tem občutkom, da smo stari.
But what people forget about America now, because it was so long ago, is that even 20 years, when it was only 21 years old, There were states that wanted to leave the Union. There were states that thought that Washington was already a fascist state and bossing them around too much. And it's easy now, looking back, to think that it was no big deal. But I think if we lived then, when it was 21 years old, we would think that maybe it wouldn't last to be 25.
Ljudje danes pozabljajo, da ko je bila Amerika stara 21 let, da so nekatere zvezne države želele oditi, da so že takrat mislili, da je Washington preveč ukazovalen, fašističen. In mogoče, če bi takrat živeli, ne bi mislili, da bomo dočakali 50 let. Zdaj lahko gledate na tiste čase nazaj, ampak takrat bi bilo verjetno drugače.
And you know, one of the things I find most amusing is that if you look at the newspapers from back then, it's hard to believe, but they were even worse than Slovene newspapers.
Zabavno se mi zdi, da ko berem časopise iz tistih časov, so bili še slabši, kot so časopisi v Sloveniji danes.
So I think that people are unduly pessimistic about Slovenia's future. And I think that without being irrationally optimistic, I think that people focus too much on the present and don't see the potential of Slovenia in the future.
Menim, da so ljudje preveč pesimistični in da pravzaprav ne vidijo potenciala, ki ga ima Slovenija za prihodnost.
A friend of mine, which was in America, said that Americans speak loudly and then Slovenians are still afraid to speak up. Do you think that is true nowadays?
I think that's partially true. It's largely true, in fact. That's why I was joking about how well you sing, even though you're also shy. When I said shy, I meant introverted. And as a people, Slovenes are more introverted than extroverted.
Torej, vprašanje je bilo, da je prijateljica bila v Ameriki, prijatelj.
Ja, izkušnja v Ameriki je bila, da Američani govorijo zelo glasno in jih ni strah spregovoriti na glas. Slovenci imamo pa to težavo, da smo tiho in da ne govorimo s polnimi pljuči, s predponom.
Ja, torej vprašanje je bilo, če je to res. Moje mnenje je, da je to res, da pravzaprav, ko sem govoril o tem, da ste Slovenci sramežljivi, sem mislil to, da ste introvertirani. Se pravi, da nas je še sram spregovoriti na glas.
I could honestly say one of the things I hated most about America when I was 20 was how loud and self-confident they were. Because I thought they had no justification for being so self-confident.
Torej, druga stvar, ki sem jo sovražil, ko sem bil star 20 let, je bilo to, da ljudje tako glasno govorijo in kako samozavestni so, ker se mi je zdelo, da nimajo nobenega razloga, da bi bili taki.
But you have also said once that Slovenians really hate each other. That in America you just pretend to hate each other, but here we really see things.
Well, I said that about politicians, but
Only politicians?
There's a few politicians in America who really are what we would call true believers on the right and the left who really hate. But for the most part, it's just show. Whereas in Slovenia, I do believe that it's genuine. People, because of the smallness of the country, because there has not been any open discussion of sensitive issues, the animosities are very genuinely personal.
And what do you suggest to do in the future? Okay.
Torej, bilo je mnenje, da je nekoč rekel, da se v Sloveniji ljudje zares sovražimo, medtem ko v Ameriki se samo pretvarjajo. In potem odgovarja, da to sem rekel za politike, ne toliko za ljudi, da v Ameriki gre bolj za šov, se pravi za neko predstavo. Ne gre toliko zares za pravo sovraštvo med levimi in desnimi, medtem ko v Sloveniji verjamem, da se res nekateri zelo močno in resnično sovražajo med sabo, glih zaradi majhnosti Slovenije in ker ni bilo nobene odprte debate, odprte diskusije o teh občutljivih temah naše zgodovine.
And the question is, what do I think should be done about it?
Yes, about the history topic, about
Yeah. I think it's very simple and very hard. I think you need an open, calm discussion. What happens in Slovenia is nobody says anything in typical introvert fashion until you get so angry that you burst out with something that's very emotional and nasty.
Torej vprašanje je bilo, kaj lahko naredimo glede zgodovine in teh tem. Odgovor pa je, da v Sloveniji se o tem res ne govori glih zaradi te tipične introvertirane drže in ljudje smo tiho, dokler se ta jeza, ta čustva toliko ne naberejo v nas, da potem eksplodiramo in rečemo nekaj, kar je zelo čustveno nabito in nesramno.
So what it really takes, I think, is just humility. You have to have enough humility and courage to realize things aren't black and white.
Kar je pomembno, kar res potrebujemo, je ponižnost. Potrebujemo veliko ponižnosti, da se zavemo, da stvari niso črno-bele.
And this is a problem both with the right and the left. They refuse to see that there's humanity on the other side and good arguments on both sides.
In to je problem tako levih kot desnih. Oboji ne želijo videti in sprejeti, da so pravzaprav na obeh stranih ljudje. Ne vidijo te človeškosti na drugi strani in da vsaka stran ima dobre in slabe argumente.
Even now, 150 years after the Civil War, if I were to stand up somewhere in America and say Robert E. Lee was a traitor and a slaveholder, people would be angry, very angry.
Še celo sedaj, po 150 letih od civilne vojne, če bi kjerkoli v Ameriki rekel, da je bil
Robert E. Lee?
Ja, da je bil da je bil sužnji lastnik in izdajalec, bi bili ljudje jezni. Še celo sedaj, po 150 let.
But in Slovenia, people are so quiet, and then when they talk, if you're from the right, the partisans are just mass murderers, and if you're from the left, the domobranci are just traitors. Mm-hmm. And you never have a more nuanced discussion of what all of that means.
But do you think it's possible?
Yes. It doesn't matter if it's possible, it's necessary.
Torej, celo sedaj v Sloveniji, ko pride do debate, so še vedno taki pogledi, da desni gledajo na leve kot na množične morilce in levi gledajo na desne kot na izdajalce. Potem je bilo vprašanje, če je možno pride do nekega dialoga in pravi, ni toliko pomembno, je možno, pomembno je, da je nujno.
So maybe do you think that help from outside, maybe from Germany or from America, will help us to do it quicker, or we just pretend that we're okay and we just...
I think there's too much pride in Slovenia to take outside help. Except, I mean, we do offer advice and our own examples from our own history, but I think Slovenes will take much greater pride in it and be more happy with it if they do it mostly themselves. But they could take examples from South Africa, from America, from Germany, from other countries that have gone through similar situations. And I think there's more and more Slovenes who feel that this is necessary. And now you finally have a president who thinks that way. So it helps. At least you have a few politicians who actually are concerned about the division.
Torej, vprašanje je bilo, če meni, da bi rabili zunanjo pomoč. In odgovor je, po mojem mnenju, smo so Slovenci preveč ponosni, da bi sprejeli tujo pomoč. In tudi bolje bi bilo za narod, da sami pridemo do nekega dialoga, do sprave, ker potem bo narod tudi bolj ponosen na to, kar je naredil. Seveda se lahko zgledujejo po Južni Ameriki, po kakšnih drugih državah, ampak na koncu bo Slovenija sama mogla rešiti te težave. In končno imamo tudi nekaj politikov, ki menijo, da je to potrebno. Recimo prvi predsednik, sedajšnji predsednik je prvi, ki je izrazil to potrebo po spravi, po pogovoru o teh težavah.
Did you or any other US officials try to facilitate this process of reconciliation in these years as you were here?
I think we did. Because we refused to stop talking about it. I think it was very helpful to Slovenia that foreigners who care about Slovenia were willing, and even when some people told us to shut up, that it was too sensitive an issue, we kept talking. And I think that helps, because once you start talking in a good way, it desensitizes the issue. If you say it's like an obscenity. If you say the F word 100 times, it's no longer shocking, and it's in a sense it's good. And if you talk about the mass graves, or you talk about heroic partisans, or whatever mix, if you talk about it enough, it's no longer something that you can't keep getting angry each time you hear it. You physically can't do it.
Torej, vprašanje je bilo, če so tuji diplomati v Sloveniji skušali vplivati na to, da bi Slovenci prej se lotili te problematike. Odgovor je, da ja, zaradi tega, ker so vedno znova poudarjali in vedno znova govorili o tem, čeprav je bilo to dokazano, da ne utihnejo, da gre za preveč občutljivo temo, so še vedno govorili o tem. Torej, primera je, tudi če gre, to je podobno kot če govorimo neko kletvico, če jo ponovimo 100-krat, postane manj občutljiva. In če govorimo o množičnih grobovih, več in več bo pač postalo manj občutljivo in bomo sposobni govoriti o tem. Se pravi, večkrat, ko slišimo, pač če bomo večkrat slišali o tem, ne moramo vedno znova biti potem jezni in čustveno vzbruhniti.
I could give you one good example. Right before I arrived in the summer of 2010, the papal nuncio, in a very gentle public statement, mentioned the mass graves. And immediately President Turk publicly denounced him, and he kept his mouth shut after that.
Drugi primer je, malo zatem, ko sem prispel v Slovenijo, je papeški nuncij omenil množične grobove in takoj zatem ga je predsednik Turk utišal in se pravi, nuncij ni nikoli več spregovoril o tem.
But now, if we go to Hudayama or Kochevsky Rock, or if we give a talk on mass graves, the media report it, it's on TV, it's in the newspapers. Wouldn't be true 3 years ago. So I think in a way, it's still a sensitive issue and it's an important issue, but it's at least one where you could start to have some discussion.
Tudi, če sedaj govorimo o Hudijami ali o Kočevskem rogu, ali če kdo obišče katero od teh grobišč, potem tudi mediji poročajo o tem in ni več tako občutljiva tema, kot je bila še nekaj let nazaj. Seveda gre še vedno za neko občutljivo temo, za pomembno temo, ampak vsaj govorimo o tem, medtem ko nekaj let nazaj z tega ne bi predstavljali.
Still a long way to go.
Še vedno nas pa čaka dolga pot.
And it's 8 o'clock. Yes? 9 o'clock. Questions?
Še kakšno vprašanje?
Really?
Res.
You're like American students.
And then one more.
Yes.
You mentioned earlier that Americans are capable of finding respect and good points of view in a mentality of opposition of America. Would you say you personally are capable of finding a positive point of view for the people who were piloting the planes on 9/11?
No, that's a good question. Torej, vprašanje je, prej ste omenili, da so v Ameriki sposobni videti dobre argumente tudi na nasprotni strani. Ali vi osebno lahko vidite kakšen dober vidik pilotov, ki so vozili letalo, ki se je zaletelo v dvojčka?
In every country, especially America perhaps, we like to, during a crisis, make our enemies very, very evil.
V vsaki državi, še posebej v Ameriki, je v kriznih časih radi svoje sovražnike naredimo res zlobne, se pravi, gledamo na njih kot na res zlobne.
Today, we can look back and say Hitler was bad, but we could understand because of the Versailles Treaty and the inflation of the 1930s and so forth, how Nazism, we could understand and not exactly sympathize, but we could realize how good people can do those bad things.
Če danes pogledamo nazaj na Hitlerja, sicer rečemo, da je bil zloben, ampak zaradi okoliščin, zaradi inflacije, potem Versajske pogodbe, lahko razumemo, kako je prišel do nacizma.
And the same with Japan now. We can finally admit it was terrible that we incarcerated Japanese Americans in jail. We could understand that the Japanese felt choked because we weren't giving them the oil they needed to survive as a country. And so that precipitated Pearl Harbor. Nobody's ever going to justify the attack on Pearl Harbor, but you could understand it in a historical sense.
Tudi podobno je z Japonsko. Lahko razumemo, da so se Japonci počutili utesnjene, ker jim nismo dovolili dostopa do nafte. Sem prav razumela. Torej, nihče ne bo nikoli mogel upravičiti napada na Pearl Harbor, ampak lahko razumemo dogodek v zgodovinskem kontekstu.
So I think in the same sort of historical context, as time goes by, and already really, people understand the underlying reasons for 9/11. And while nobody's going to justify or try to say they're heroes for flying planes any more than kamikazes were, you could see there is a certain courage to it and a certain devotion to God, a twisted devotion, but it's not good to think of it as just evil. It's immature and it doesn't get you anywhere.
Torej, tudi sedaj, ko pogledamo nazaj, ko se pravzaprav čas mineva od tega dogodka, lahko razumemo razloge, zakaj je prišlo do strmoglavljanja dvojčkov. Lahko razumemo, da je vzadaj neka sprevržena ljubezen do Boga, celo neka stopnja junaštva. Čeprav nihče ne bo nikoli mogel upravičiti tega, kar se je zgodilo, ampak lahko razumemo razloge za tem.
You would be too young to remember, but right after 9/11, President Bush referred to them as cowards.
Verjetno ste premladi, da bi se spomnili, ampak takoj po tem dogodku jih je predsednik Bush označil za reve, za strahopetce.
And one of the American comedians on TV, like 2 days after, said, "What's he talking about? They flew planes into buildings. They're not cowards. They may be lots of things, but they're not cowards."
In kmalu zatem je neki komedijant na televiziji rekel, le o čem govori. Saj so z letali se zaleteli v dvojčka. mogoče so veliko drugih stvari, ampak sigurno ne strahopetci.
But at that moment, nobody in America thought it was funny, and nobody agreed with him, even though in reality it was correct.
Ja, in takrat v tistem trenutku se seveda ni nihče strinjal z njim, nihče ni mislil, da je to smešno, čeprav v resnici je bilo resnično.
But if somebody said it today in America, there'd be lots of people would argue both sides, but it wouldn't create the same outrage, because time has a wonderful way of giving you perspective.
Če bi kaj takega rekli danes, bi bili seveda argumenti na eni ali drugi strani, ampak ne bi bilo tako močnega čustvenega odziva ali jeze. Čas je čudovita stvar, ki ti daje neko perspektivo potem za dogodke, za nazaj.
But time has stood still in Slovenia. It's still 1945, because there's been no openness, no discussion, no progress. And because of that, time and normal human interaction has not been able to make things, to give you better perspective.
Ampak za Slovenijo se je čas ustavil v letu 1945 in ker ni bilo odprtosti, ni bilo možnosti za dialog, se pravzaprav ni omogočilo, da bi dobili nov pogled na dogodke, na našo zgodovino, neko zdravo perspektivo.
Tukaj nas je večinoma mladih in mislim, da smo to bodoča generacija, ki bomo nekako ustvarjali prihodnost Slovenije. Bi nam dali kakšen predlog, kako naj bo ta prihodnost potem za vse nas boljša, z večjim upanjem, z boljšo, da bomo z veseljem gledali naprej?
Torej, so most of the people here are young and like a future generation for Slovenia. Can you give us some advice what to do to change things for the better in the future?
I think there's several things. One thing you'll do automatically, don't listen to your parents too much.
Obstaja več stvari, eno stvar boste verjetno naredili avtomatsko in sicer ne preveč poslušati staršev.
And I think it's important for Slovenes. Slovenes are very deceptive because they're very intelligent and very highly educated, but they're not very worldly.
Torej, Slovenci so zelo izobraženi, visoko izobraženi, intelektualni, ampak niso dovolj razgledani, svetovljanski.
For example, they all speak better English than me, but very few of them have ever gone outside of Slovenia.
Torej, primer tega je, veliko jih govori boljšo angleščino od mene, ampak zelo malo od njih so šli ven iz Slovenije.
And nothing opens the mind better than travel.
In nič ne ustvari razgledanosti boljše kot potovanje.
You'll have more respect for other countries and you'll love your own country more.
Torej, s potovanjem potem se ustvari boljše razumevanje, boljše spoštovanje drugih držav in večja ljubezen do domovine.
And of course, listen to everything the nuns tell you.
In upoštevajte vse, kar povejo sestre.
That's good. Yes, sir.
Po neki strani mislim, da smo Slovenci pa Američani v nekem podobnem položaju. Vsi imamo neko svojo deželo in ste govorili pač o ljubezni do domovine. Kakšen je odnos, recimo, če lahko primerjate odnos Američanov do svoje države, kot je New York, pa Kansas, pa Texas in do United States of America in kako vidite našo ljubezen do recimo Slovenije ali pa Evropske unije?
So, in a way, Slovenia and America are in a similar position, in a way that can you compare how the Americans in individual states love their states and what is their relationship to America as a whole, in the United States, and what is the love of Slovenians to our country and what relationship we have to the European Union? How do you see it?
I think it's very fundamentally different. I think when we first started out, all the states thought they were separate countries. Their identity, like Robert E. Lee, who you've never heard of, really thought Virginia was his country. And America was just a contract between all the states to work together.
Gre za neko temeljno razliko, ko je na začetku v Ameriki so pravzaprav je vsaka zvezna država mislila, da so pač neodvisna država in da je to Združene države Amerike, da je to samo pač neka pogodba.
If we could use an analogy, the individual states at that time were the organic identity of people, and the United States itself was an artificial legal construction. Sorry. That's hard to...
Torej, če uporabimo malo analogije, v tistem času so bile zvezne države pravzaprav naravna struktura, naravna povezanost ljudi, medtem ko Združene države Amerike je bilo umetno ustvarjena povezanost.
But that's no longer true for two very good reasons. One is there's been too much blood in the Civil War and World War I, World War II, Korea, Vietnam, Iraq. Because we've all suffered together through all those wars and all the economic depressions, people don't identify with their individual states anymore. They only identify, for the most part, there are exceptions, but for the most part, people just think of themselves as American.
Ampak to seveda ne drži več, zaradi dveh razlogov. Eden je ta, da smo prestali preveč vojn, preveč prelivanja krvi in ekonomskih kriz in zaradi tega se ljudje več ne identificirajo z lastno zvezno državo, ampak vidijo sebe kot Američane.
The other reason, of course, is that we're very mobile, unlike Slovenes. The average American moves every 2 or 3 years inside the country. So you may be in California 1 year, and New York the next, and Kansas the next. So most Americans don't develop a provincial identity.
Drugi razlog je pa to, da smo Američani zelo mobilni, da se selimo povprečno na 2-3 leta. Se pravi, lahko si 1 leto v Kansasu, čez 2 leti že v New Yorku in tako naprej. To je razlika, se pravi, to je drugače kot v Sloveniji. Američani se ne identificirajo s nekim posebnim krajem, da bi se tam ustalili.
I think when people say they're a Virginian now or a Texan, for the most part it's like what school you went to. You have a certain fondness for what university you went to or high school, but it doesn't mean that much anymore deep down.
Torej, če danes nekdo reče, da je iz Virginije ali iz Teksasa, to pravzaprav bolj pomeni, v katero šolo hodiš, kje imaš službo, ne toliko res neka zavest, identiteta, identificiranje s to zvezno državo.
For Slovenia, all the European countries and the EU, I think where you are where we were 200 years ago. Your organic emotions and commitment are to the country you're in, and the EU is still just a legal construction.
Če sedaj primerjam z Evropsko unijo in Slovenijo in z drugimi državami v Evropi, mislim, da ste tam, kjer smo bili mi 200 let nazaj. Se pravi, ljudje v Evropski uniji se identificirajo z lastno kulturo, z državo, v kateri živijo. Evropska unija je pa samo nek formalni konstrukt.
For that to change, you'll need lots of time, lots of mobility, mixing up the different countries, and a real fundamental change in ethnic identity.
Da bi se to spremenilo, boste potrebovali veliko mobilnosti, potovanj, pa Veliko časa, ja.
Sprememba v etnični pripadnosti.
Sprememba v etnični pripadnosti.
Don't mess up
I'm
again.
getting tired.
I think one of the real problems with Europe and much of the world is that your nationality is based on ethnic group.
Problem je v tem, da je vaša nacionalnost temelji na etnični skupini.
You know, Slovenes are Slovene, Germans are mostly German, French are French, whereas in America, we're everything.
Torej, Nemci so Nemci, Slovenci ste Slovenci, medtem ko v Ameriki smo vse.
So it's easier to identify with America if you're not a German, even if they lived here 3 generations, will never think of themselves as a Slovene. Whereas if a Filipino comes to America, after 3 days, they think they're an American. It's different.
Torej, tudi če Nemec živi v Sloveniji, da je družina v Sloveniji že 3 generacije, še vedno ne mislijo, da so Slovenci, ampak mislijo o sebi, da so Nemci. Medtem ko, če Filipinec pride v Ameriko, je po 3 dneh že samega sebe razume kot Američana.
I think you all need to change your country's name so they have nothing to do with the ethnic groups in your country.
Torej, menim, da morate vsi spremeniti imena držav, da ne bojo imeli nič skupnega z etnično skupino.
Like Prešerenovia or something. Right? Anyway, sorry. Good.
Bi se zahvalili, da ste uboga sestre.
Thank you very much for obeying the sister.
Ker mislim, da takšen kvaliteten večer nam res lahko pomaga pri rasti, pri odraščanju od nekih idealov ali pa enega ali pa drugega ekstrema ljubezni.
Evenings like this can really help us grow up and grow in this understanding that neither of the extremes of, twisted love is good.
In če papež Frančišek pravi, da so stari očetje pa stare mame zelo dobri v družini, torej tudi kakšen nasvet, ki pride od zunaj, kakšen pogled od starejše države lahko pomaga k rasti in k modrosti, tako mladim kot smo mi.
So Pope Francis says that some advice from grandparents or older generations can be helpful. So maybe some advice from all countries that are older than ours.
God, I thought you were saying I was old.
Ne, država.
We're talking about countries,
Okay.
not you.
Tako, en mali spomin VIDES-a.
Voilà. Thank you very much. This was delightful. Thank you very much. I wish you had more questions. What's wrong with the women of this country? At least you asked.
Bilo mi je veselje, najlepša hvala. Želim si, da bi imeli več vprašanj. Se sprašujem, kaj narobe z ženskami v tej državi.
But thank you very much.
Torej, najlepša hvala.